Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I am Betsy Boughton, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the 10th presentation in this series of 11 webinars focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. And the goal of this series is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session, and please type your questions for the speaker in the Q&A tool at any time during or after the presentation. And today's webinar will conclude promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is Soil Carbon Responses to Grazing Land Management in the Northern Plains, and today's speaker is Dr. Mark Liebig, a research soil scientist with the USDA-ARS in Mandan, North Dakota. Dr. Liebig works with the multidisciplinary team of scientists to develop soil, crop, and animal management practices for the Great Plains to overcome limitations to productivity while maintaining or enhancing environmental quality. So I will turn it over to Mark for his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mark Liebig. I work with the Ag Research Service in Mandan, North Dakota, and I'm going to share a bit about some of the work that we've done with soil carbon and grazing land management here in the Northern Plains. Before I start, I want to thank the organizer of this webinar series. It's been a fantastic set of talks. It's great to learn from others throughout the United States on this vitally important topic, and it's a privilege to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we've done up here. So to get started, as I'd mentioned, I work at the Ag Research Service, most specifically the Northern Great Plains Research Laboratory. We're the Northern Plains LTAR site. Here we're very much in a semi-arid continental climate, fairly brisk winters, but also hot summers. We're probably known more so for our weather extremes than the averages. Rolling topography is predominant. Our soils are relatively young, glaciated in the last 13,000 years, and so as a result, they're highly fertile soils. Agriculture in the region has been practiced for thousands of years. Our Native Americans practiced bottomland agriculture, producing corn and squash, beans, sunflower, tobacco on the bottomlands, and then hunting buffalo and other large mammals on the uplands. And it was a very productive form of agriculture that lasted a long, long time. The lab that I work at hasn't been around quite as long. We were established in 1912. We've always had a sort of natural resources research focus. We're currently sort of zeroing in on developing adaptive and integrative practices across a range of agroecosystems for our stakeholders. And we do it using sort of a multidisciplinary approach. So, fun place to work. So in terms of sort of the context from the standpoint of climate, it's getting warmer here. North Dakota is warming faster than any other state in the contiguous US, about a 1/4 degree Fahrenheit per decade. And if you look at the projections in the future, it's going to continue to warm even more and also generally become drier. So evapotranspiration is going to increase. We're going to have fewer colder days, and on the precipitation side, we're going to see more heavy precipitation events, which is fairly typical across other regions throughout the United States. So our already climatically extreme environment is even going to become more so, and so this really emphasizes the importance of putting together management practices that can adapt effectively to these forthcoming changes. But there's another piece to this too, right? So the other side of the coin is the mitigation part, and there's perhaps ways that we might be able to identify practices that can lower our emissions or even remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And there are all sorts of different initiatives that have been proposed in the last, at least the last 10 years. It seems like it's really amplified more recently with offset markets and so forth. And so it's really important to make sure that what is done is founded on good science. And I think that's sort of our role here, I guess. So it comes, our focus here is to look at our perennial systems and most specifically our grazing land systems, and they do definitely, I think, have a role to play with respect to the mitigation piece. Um, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about first the stocks of soil carbon in our grasslands, and kind of set that as a sort of a benchmark before we start talking about management practices to affect carbon dynamics. So what we see is we generally have fairly high organic carbon stocks down to a meter in our region. If we compare it to other regions throughout the Great Plains, our soil organic carbon stocks to a meter are greater than in other parts of the Great Plains. We also have a fair amount of inorganic carbon down to a meter as well. Not as much as obviously they would have in the southern part of the United States, but it's still fairly significant. So there's a lot of carbon in the top meter for many of our soils. If we look across different biomes, the predominant biome for our region is mixed grass prairie, and so it's about half as much carbon as what we see in our eastern tall grass prairies, but it's greater than the other biomes that we have throughout the western United States. About 50% of the carbon is in the top 30 centimeters or 12 inches roughly of soil. So this is really important to point out in that it's something that can be lost really easily with conversion. If you look across the Great Plains, the effects of conversion to arable agriculture have been significant. Roughly a 42% loss across the Great Plains, representing about a fifth of the total carbon that's been lost across all cropland in the United States. And it's really tough to get this back once you've made this conversion. Just pulling from some data that we have here in Mandan, the bar on the right is our sort of our moderately grazed pasture, sort of our native check that we've have here at the station, and then the bar on the left is our cropland, and this is cropland that has been farmed with no-till practices, good solid no-till practices, cropping continuously, following good recommended practices for about 3 decades when we made these measurements. And you still see pretty substantial differences in the carbon stocks, particularly in the surface depths. And so the point being here is that once we've made that conversion, it's really difficult to be able to sort of claw that back using sort of conventional cropping practices by themselves. And so I think what this points out is that most important thing here is to keep grasslands. I think Justin Durner mentioned this a few weeks ago. I fully support that. I think we have to make sure that we keep them grasslands, don't have them converted, because once we do, it's really tough to get those carbon stores back. Okay, so I'm going to shift a little bit, and we'll talk about some management effects on soil carbon. And this is just going to kind of pull from different studies that have been conducted, mostly from the last 25, 30 years. It's gone on longer, but yeah, we just got to kind of focus things a little bit given the time. So to start out, I got to let you know. So we have these historical pastures that were set up by J.T. Sarvis in 1916, and they're an incredible resource. Initially, we had 4 stocking rates. It was reduced down to 2 stocking rates, a moderate and a heavy, in 1945. But we've been able to keep them going for all that time. So they've got some really good history to them. They're continuously grazed May to October with either yearlings or 2-year-old steers. We do have exclosures And then the big caveat is that they're not replicated. That was just not something they did back then. But we have a lot of time, and so there's that is sort of the important thing to consider. Yeah, here's a overhead shot of where we have the moderate and heavily grazed pastures. Should also point out that moderately grazed pasture is a relocatable neon site now, and so there's all kinds of things being measured out there with the neon involvement. All right, so first let's look at grazing versus no grazing, and we'll use some work that was done by Al Frank, a plant physiologist here, for many years, and he was looking at carbon stalks, in this case, down to the about top 12 inches in this case. And what he found was that the soil carbon stalks and the exclosure were about equivalent to that under the heavily grazed pasture, but both were greater than the moderately grazed pasture. But he pointed out that there were some different reasons why this was the case. Under heavy grazing, we had a lot of blue grama, and there was a lot of root biomass, much more root biomass in that heavily grazed pasture compared to moderate, that was driving up the carbon levels. Whereas with the exclosure, it was overrun with a fair amount of invasives, and there was just an immense litter layer. Still is, in fact. And so there was a lot of almost like a O horizon that was contributing to higher carbon content there. So two different reasons why things are greater, but the exclosure and the heavy being the same, but both being greater than moderate. So another piece to this story is that, those samples were taken in 1991, and then it started raining a lot up here. And what that did is that it really favored the growth of a cool season invasives, specifically Kentucky bluegrass. And so a resampling of the pastures was done in 2014 by Matt Sanderson. And he looked at not only just the changes in carbon amounts in the soil, but also the C13 signature. And what he found was that that in the top 3 inches of soil, that's the 0 to 7.6 centimeters, carbon was increasing between 1991 and 2014. So I have that circled there to the right. And it was associated with a more negative C13 signal. So that is associated with the higher prevalence of C3 grasses, cool season grasses, and less C4 grasses. And so that certainly is consistent with what we've seen with respect to vegetation composition in these pastures. Kentucky bluegrass has moved in, and it's been a little more aggressive where we've had the exclosure, and less so where we have heavy grazing. So but changes indeed are occurring, but the carbon amounts are increasing, but just in the top 3 inches. Okay, so this is a little redundant, but I kind of came on the scene in 1999, got involved in GraceNet, and went and did a resampling of the pastures in 2003. Pretty much confirmed what Al had already seen. We were seeing, well, not Al, but what Matt had seen in with respect to higher amounts of carbon in the heavily grazed pasture, but just in near surface depths. If you took the entire stalk already down to a meter, there was no difference between the two stalking rates. We did measure some other carbon pools, the microbial biomass. I did particulate organic matter. We did root biomass. I just show a couple of the graphs here. It was higher under the heavily grazed pasture compared to the moderate, but not significantly so, okay? And I didn't show palm because it looked exactly like microbial biomass C. So we thinking here the root biomass is probably driving some of this, though the depths do not match. I acknowledge that. But again here the higher root biomass and heavily grazed pasture being associated with the more prevalence of the blue grama, in that pasture. So All right, so those are the carbon stocks. What about fluxes? All right, so this is ties to some work that Al Frank did. He had a Bowen ratio unit, which is sort of the predecessor to the eddy covariance approach. And he was measuring carbon fluxes continuously for 6 years out on our moderately grazed pasture. And found that there's quite a bit of variation from year to year, but we were sort of a CO2 sink for all of those years with an average CO2 flux of 108 grams of CO2 per meter squared. That comes out to around about 260 pounds of carbon per acre per year, sort of being accrued by the pasture. So it's not a lot. It's not a lot, but it's positive, right? So that's pointed in the right direction. All right, so some other work that has been done, woody species like our snowberry, a buffaloberry, even some Russian olive trees have gotten in there. They've sort of taken over, particularly sort of the north sides of our that accumulate snow in the wintertime of our landscapes, and without fire, they just proliferate, right? And so we have a lot of our landscapes have these woody species, and we were interested in seeing how the carbon stocks differed across the different ages of those woody clusters compared to a transition site and also our grassland that hadn't been invaded yet. And this is work that Anna Springsteen did for her master's degree. And we calculated that there was an accrual rate of about 18 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. I think that, putting that on maybe more understandable terms, it's about 160 or so pounds of carbon per acre per year. So again, pretty small amount being secured, so or accrued through the expansion of woody species. Did find that a lot of that increase was associated with the coarse fraction of particulate organic matter. And then on the flux side, Al and Jim Carn, they put on a Bowen ratio unit for a couple of years in the same region and measured an accrual rate that was somewhere in the ballpark of what we measured in the soil. So that was a nice little validation, I guess, of using two different approaches. Okay, and then some work that John Hendrickson led in the early 2000s, looking at interseeding legumes in our sort of mixed grass pasture that already had relatively high carbon stocks from the get-go. And we had a few different types of alfalfa that were transplanted and allowed to grow for 4 years. And we found that the carbon increased in the top 10 centimeters under the grazing type of alfalfa. This is the Anik variety. I was pretty blown away that given the high stocks that we already had within the pasture, that we would see an increase, but in fact we did. But then again, you look at the literature, and Matt Mortensen actually had done some work in South Dakota, and he recorded even a higher level of accrual where alfalfa had been interseeded into pastures. So that's we haven't tracked that over time. This is a relatively short period of time. I would imagine that things will tail off over time, but it's an interesting outcome nonetheless. All right, so in terms of management effects of soil carbon, sort of a summary, heavier stocking rates contributed to greater soil C and surface depths. Whether it's the invasion of cool season grasses or expansion of woody species or even some interseeding of grazing type alfalfa, all of those seem to contribute to greater soil carbon. But the accrual rates are modest, so don't get too excited. I mean, it's not a lot. Again, I think the big thing here is that we have a lot of carbon in these grasslands. We want to keep them there, and want to keep them grasslands as much as we possibly can. All right, so I should probably stop, but there's more to this story, right? Because we've been talking about everything that's more or less on the right side of this of this schematic, but I'm sure as we can all appreciate, there's these other greenhouse gases that we have to consider, namely methane and nitrous oxide. Those are, they kind of complicate matters, right? Because our non-CO2 greenhouse gases, they differ in their capacity to trap heat in the atmosphere. And so you have to have a mechanism to be able to kind of put them on an equal footing. And we use this global warming potential as a tool to be able to do that. And you can see in the blue box there, the equivalency in terms of the heat trapping capacity for the methane and nitrous oxide. It doesn't take a lot of nitrous oxide to have a really big effect with respect to trapping heat relative to CO2. And so this is the reason we're considering this here is that we want to talk about climate mitigation. We have to look at all three of these gases, not just carbon. And so we did a little work on this as part of the GraceNet protocol, and we focused initially on our historical grazing pastures that we had at the station. And we used this equation here to kind of get at sort of a net greenhouse gas balance, looking at the end fertilizer production and application that was associated with one of the pastures, which I'll review here in a minute. We had, of course, the methane emissions associated with enteric fermentation, the carbon change in the soil, and then the fluxes of the methane and the nitrous oxide coming off the soil. And so we did this for 3 years, and we did these measurements on two of the pastures that I've already talked about, the moderately grazed and the heavily grazed pasture, but then we also added a crested wheatgrass pasture that was established in 1932. And from about the late 60s onward, it was fertilized with a low rate of nitrogen, about 40 pounds per acre in the fall, which boosted production and also allowed them to have a little bit heavier stocking rate. So it made for a really interesting contrast relative to our historically native pastures. We used the static chamber method for trace glass fluxes, dipped into our awesome soil archive and found some samples from 1959 that Russ Loran collected down to 2 feet and compared them to what we collected in 2003. So we had a 44-year time step there that was pretty robust. And then for the enteric emissions, we didn't have the capacity to actually measure that. So we leaned on literature-derived estimates based on the quality of the forage that was available. And so there's a lot to this. I'll just kind of share with you sort of the big picture outcome. And so what you have here is you have the three grazing management systems, okay, and then the 5 attributes that I talked about in the equation. And so the crested wheatgrass pasture, we'll start with that. It has, oh yes, and so the values that are red and positive, that is net greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. And if they're black and negative, that's greenhouse gases getting sort of accrued or added to sort of or pulled away from the atmosphere, okay? Right, so stepping through this, you see that the production of N fertilizer and its application, there's a cost to that right off the bat. For the crested wheatgrass pasture. And then the enteric fermentation, of course, that's going to be positive as well, but it's very much a function of the stocking rate. And we had a relatively low stocking rate under the moderately grazed pasture, increased with heavily grazed, and then it is slightly greater with crested wheatgrass pasture. So there's that piece. Our soil organic carbon change, again, this is using archive samples. These were fairly robust values, higher than what we'd measured in other methods, other approaches, but still in line with the literature that we see with other measurements made throughout the region. So I think they're solid. Our soils, of course, are methane sinks because they're dry most of the year. And then you got the big one, the N2O emissions here. And our emissions, N2O emissions in our moderately heavily grazed pasture were moderate, not too bad, but they were really high in the crested wheatgrass pasture. And again, we were applying that nitrogen fertilizer in the fall, not perhaps the most efficient way to do it. And in fact, our greatest N2O emissions were happening between December and February during sort of midwinter thawing events. So it underscored the importance of making gas flux measurements throughout the year. So all that together, you find that your two historically native pastures are net sinks for greenhouse gases, whereas the crested wheatgrass pasture was a source. If we were to express these data on a sort of an intensity basis, you would see that the moderately grazed pasture would actually be sort of taking up more greenhouse gases per kilogram or pound of beef produced compared to the heavily grazed pasture. So, this is just, I guess, a different way, maybe a more inclusive way to sort of to talk about sort of mitigation potential of our practices, where soil organic carbon change is a really big contributor to it. So, all right. So, I've been here for over 25 years, and it seems like you got more questions than answers. I guess that's the good thing about research. But some things that I kind of sort of or struggle with is how our methods can better capture the heterogeneity that we see in our grazing lands. Not just here on the station, but as we get out and do on-ranch research, it's a real big challenge, and it's something I think that we all are challenged with. We're warming, and we're going to get warmer in the wintertime. I really kind of wonder about the permanence of soil organic carbon. And maybe there's some management practices that we can put in place to make sure that can be, could be ensure that can be permanent and not lost through mineralization. We've got a lot of soil inorganic carbon down below 16 inches. Is there any dynamics there that we need to be looking at over the long term? I'm not sure. And then, of course, there's always going to be management-related questions. Two that kind of come to mind for our work here is the role of alternative grazers, the sheep, the goats, and so forth. And the big one is fire. My colleague David Toledo is leading our grazing land common experiment here at Mandan, and he's been experimenting and working with different fire regimes. And we're hopefully going to have some stories to tell with that here in a couple of years. Should be pretty exciting. So anyway, thanks so much for your attention, and look forward to your questions and discussion coming right up. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a great presentation with lots of information in it. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you. I already see some popping up in the Q&A section. And so I'll just start reading through those. And the first one is about you've provided accrual rates. Do you see any evidence of continued accrual, or is there evidence of saturation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So our last sort of comprehensive sampling we did on the historical pastures was in 2014. And so we did go back this year to do that, to ask that very question. It will be interesting to see what has happened, because we've had some pretty dry years in that decade, in much like what Justin found down at CPER with some of his long-term historical pastures. When they had drought over a 10-year period, they saw some loss. So I don't know. We'll see about that. I should note, though, that one of our historical pastures, the moderately grazed pasture, is a neon relocatable site. And so they have any covariance going on there at that site. And I think it's been active since 2017. So it wouldn't cover the entire period, but for part of it. And I can't say I've looked at that data, but from the soil side, we hope to have that story available next year. So.
Sort of related to that, you did talk about different fractions responding, like there was the coarse particulate organic matter that was increased in some of the treatments. Is that could you speak to how stable those different fractions are? Is there something that you would like to, like, that's more stable than others?
Oh, that's a good question. And the stability or lability of those fractions is not something we have looked at necessarily, like through mineralization studies, and such. We've just looked at quantifying the total pool. But it is interesting. It is interesting because of course, the plant composition across those historical pastures differs. You know, the heavily grazed, there's a lot more blue grama, whereas in the moderately grazed, the bluegrass is just really predominant. And so you've got some differences in the type of litter material that's being deposited, how that affects mineralization dynamics and within certain organic matter pools. We haven't looked at, but it's something that's certainly worthy of investigation.
Okay. There's a second question here. How heavily grazed were the heavy and moderate fields? And was it determined by stubble heights?
So it was not determined by stubble heights. Those stocking rates, I did have I had them listed in one of the slides, but I glossed over it probably pretty fast. So in the moderately grazed pasture sort of follows the sort of NRCS guidelines in terms of a stocking rate. I think that's, oh gosh, geez, maybe about what? Maybe about one animal unit per hectare. Maybe you can do the conversion there. The heavily grazed is right around 2.4, if I recall from my notes. So there's quite a difference in intensity, but keep in mind there are differences in the sizes of those pastures. So we're kind of making do with what was available based on what they started with in 1916.
Um, how did you design your N2O emissions measurements to capture the intermittent nature of the emissions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're using the static chamber approach where we're going out and collecting samples, and a lot of it is just watching the temperature and timing your sampling to align with what you think might be a sort of a hot moment. And so the winter time was really difficult, but we came to learn pretty early on that those midwinter thawing periods were sort of prime times to be able to get out there. And so you just, you marshal the troops, you get out there and you do the work. But, there's, I think, and we've learned also from our work in integrated and our cropping systems trials that there's this convergence of temperature and moisture conditions that warrant making sure that you're out there to potentially capture something. But it's an imperfect, it's an imperfect approach. I mean, ideally, you would be able to make these measurements in real time, automated chambers. Others have been able to do that. We've had to kind of utilize the resources that we've had the best we can to do that. And some of it is just sort of watching the temperature and knowing what your soil moisture content is.
Oh, that was really surprising they were in the winter thaws too. I
Oh,
thought
yeah, that really blew me away. But Reynold Lemke with Ag Canada had actually he had found that I think sometime before, and in this work that he was doing, I think in cropping systems, and so we were kind of alerted to the notion that could happen. And in that particular pasture, that crested wheatgrass pasture, it was primed for N2O emissions because I mean, they're putting down the fertility at the absolute worst time in the fall because it was convenient and the cattle crew had time, right? And then so it's just sitting there, and then you get wet conditions, it gets anaerobic, it warms up, and then boom, that's where it happened. And so so if you're going to do these annual assessments of gas flux, you got to do it the whole year around, particularly where the management suggests that you might have some hot moments. In some of our other work with, particularly in cropping systems where the nitrogen management is a bit more efficient, if I can mention that, there's not a lot that goes on in the wintertime. And so you can sort of spread out your sampling events maybe every other week, sometimes even longer than that. And the crew is really happy about that because it can be a little cold in the wintertime when we're going out and collecting samples. So
I
it's
bet. Wow. So that means, so have you looked at like different timings of fertilization application and that affects that can be cause reduced emissions?
So not on the grazing land side. We haven't. We've just sort of we just looked at those three pastures and said, oh, that's the system that they've got. We'll just evaluate it. On the cropland side, we're starting to do that work with split applications in corn, overlaying cover crops, trying to find ways to be able to tie up that nitrogen so it's not lost.
All right. Here's a question. In terms of climate solutions, what matters is the additional benefit of a shift in management. If the baseline, whether moderate or heavy, is sequestering lots of carbon over many decades, do you see any practices that can increase this rate of sequestration?
So this is a great question. And so for that, I'm going to kind of I'll talk a little bit about, so we have two common experiments within the LTAR, cross-site work. And one is on the grazing land side that David Toledo leads up. And we've been doing that experiment since 2019. And he has some novel treatments that include what was kind of considered by our advisory group as mob grazing. And then we also have some fire treatments as well. And so, fire be incorporated to kind of maybe shift the plant community composition away from the bluegrass back to natives. And then we have two fire treatments, one that is grazed and one that is non-grazed. I think it's going to be those three treatments that maybe if we're going to move the needle on carbon, maybe that's where it's going to happen. But again, that's a story. We took our baseline measurements in 2019 and 2020. It was a staggered start. And so then we resampled that in 2023 and 2024. So it's a story yet. I mean, the samples, actually, I laid them out ready for grinding last week. So we just got to get the work done to tell that story. But those are two possibilities.
That's really interesting. I'll be interested to see how fire fits
Yes,
into the whole equation because it is a release of CO2, but it
right,
can increase productivity and
right.
it's so yeah, that's very interesting.
Yep, yep.
Okay, another question. Did your GHG net balance equation include CO2 soil fluxes? And they saw methane and N2O, but curious about CO2 as well.
Right, right. So there's a few ways to get at that. One way would be if all of those treatments were instrumented with eddy covariance towers, then we could get at the carbon balance through that way. But only one of the three pastures had that instrumentation. And so what we did instead to get at the carbon piece is that we looked in the soil. And so we collected samples, of course, in 2003, but carbon changes really slow, particularly in our perennial systems. And so what I did as a baseline is that I went back to our soil archive. We have an archive here, over 5,000 samples. Some of the samples go back to 1917. So it's really quite a resource. And I was able to find samples that were collected by a former scientist, Russ Lorenz, in 1959. And he had everything really nicely labeled from each of the historical pastures that they had at the time. And they sampled down to 2 feet. And so we matched up our depths and then looked at the change between 1959 and 2003 as the carbon piece. Now, the caveat with that, I'm first to admit it, is that we didn't have bulk density data in 1959. So the equivalent mass, calculation that we use for those stocks, we assumed that there was no change in bulk density, which, yeah, that's sort of hand wavy as to whether or not that's valid, but you kind of work with what you have. So getting back to it, we didn't, the carbon piece was tied in with the change in stocks.
Yeah, that's so great to have that archive and
Absolutely.
amazing. Heavy grazed rotational, or was it continuous?
So it was both of those were just continuously grazed. So they go out in May, and most years they're wrapping up in sometime mid-October,
Mm. You might have said it is these are stocker operations mainly out there.
right? Yearlings typically. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
And do you see any of your stakeholder community using rotational grazing, or is it mostly continuous?
It's a mix across the board. There's what we have for our advisory group for the grazing land common experiment is that there's strong interest in the rotational and heavy grazing, and cycling through and giving ample rest and so forth. Um, it's interesting though, you have the term mob grazing, and everyone has a different idea of what that means, and so operationalizing that for our experiment was really tough because we couldn't get really consensus because everyone is adapting on their own terms, right? And so we did what made sense for us, and it was we would take the plots that we have for the grazing land study are about an acre in size, and we would partition them up in quarters and graze them fairly heavily before moving, and then David and his crew would be monitoring stubble in that case before moving them on. So
Okay. Lots of good questions here. I'm seeing a lot more in the Q&A. It in these research projects, were there any different shoot, I'm having trouble understanding. Were there any different production systems under pasture? So the example is organic versus conventional. I guess we could also think about like grazed crop residue, things like that.
you know um I think for well, I think what some of our work has gotten kind of to that in our integrated crop livestock work. And so we've had a long-term study here at Mandan since 1999. It's gone through, I don't know, I think we're on our fourth phase now. And though while it's not organic per se, it does overlay both enterprises where we're trying to produce a commodity crop, but also utilize stover and interseeded cover crops as grazing. And we've even had a phase where we had a perennial phase in there as well, which really provides a lot of good adaptable options because you could potentially hay it, you potentially graze it. There's regrowth in spring. Yeah, so that allows us to kind of be adaptable for our highly variable sites. So I don't know if I quite answered that, but we don't have like embedded treatments within the historical pastures per se. So they're just sort of managed all as one.
Okay. Here's a question in the chat I just saw. Wondering if soil inorganic carbon may be changing at 30 to 100 centimeters with the three pasture conditions, assuming some acidification with nitrogen application or root enhanced carbonate production.
Yes, yes, yes. In fact, I think I do report soil nitrogen data from the three pastures in the 2006 paper. And yes, that the very intuitive to think that there could potentially be acidification in the crested wheatgrass pasture, because in fact there is. That 0 to 5 centimeter depth is in the fives. It's quite acidified, and our microbial biomass levels are the lowest across all three of the pastures, and so it's there. I'm kind of wondering, is there I've got all my references for the talk. Where could I share them in the chat, or where could I put those?
Yeah, I think you could put them in the chat.
All right, let me just copy and back. It's going to be kind of long. Oh, well, it doesn't want me to paste it. Let me try it again.
Or another thing, if it doesn't work, we can also put them on the website with this when we post this presentation.
That might be what we'll have to do. Yeah, it's not really allowing me to paste those. I should have probably created a Google form and then pasted
Oh,
that. But
okay.
we'll make sure they're available. I have them all organized and they're listed in the order they're presented, so people can go to the individual papers if they want to.
Yeah. we have one more time for one more question, so I'm going to ask this. How are grazing systems in North Dakota affected by woody encroachment? Are there any studies on management practices and their effects on how this woody encroachment affects SOC and water dynamics?
Yeah, no, it's a real thing, right? Because we've had, with the cessation of fire, we get the woody species. They tend to accumulate on north-facing slopes, and they can really take over. And part of our work with Anna Springsteen's, looking at the shrub clusters, kind of found that you can see a small rate of accrual as those clusters grow, but it's a trade-off because you're giving up the forage that would otherwise be provided by the grassland. But but you can talk the other side too. It's also providing shade during times of hot temperatures and so forth. So it's a trade-off, but it is real, and one of the reasons our fire treatment is what it is within the grazing land study is actually to get at the woody species.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. We're all excited to hear about the future results coming out of your site. Um, so that's all we have time for today. I just want to thank Mark for your presentation and everyone for joining us today. And thank you for all your questions. They were really great. So thank you for attending this session of the Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon webinar series. Please note that a link to a recording of today's presentation will be available on our webpage. And please plan to join us on December 16th for our final webinar in this series. It's called Depth Distribution of Soil Organic Carbon and Nitrogen Fractions in a Tallgrass Prairie in Oklahoma by Dr. Alan Franzlubers, and we hope to see you then. And please fill out this webinar poll before you leave. Thank you.